All right, so let's talk briefly about Express, and then we're gonna change a couple lines of code. Um, there are many different web technologies, frameworks you can use with Node.js. We are focusing on Express because it fits our needs pretty well. Um, it fits our needs well because it's pretty flexible and it's very minimal. So like we're already using Express and we only had to have a couple lines of code. That is good. What Express helps us to do is what's called routing. Routing is when the client request comes in to a given path, how does it find the right function to run the code for? Okay. And that's the code that we wrote right here, right? So this is an example of like routing, a route. We'll refer to this slash thing as a path. Sometimes we call it an endpoint. We often call it a route as well. We kind of use those terms like almost interchangeably. But this is what Express helps us do is connect a path to a function that gets run when that path is specified. In addition, Express supports something called middleware, which we're going to use later. Middleware lets us inject additional functions between the request and the function that's eventually gets called. This is great for stuff like authentication. Like we want to make sure the user's logged in before we send them to the page, things like that. So you can think of I like this summary here, an Express application. It's a series of middleware functions that get called one after another. Based on the specified route from the client that's requested. Okay. So we're going to focus a little bit more on Express routing, which is all about figuring out which function gets invoked based on the HTTP request. As we saw, because we printed it out, the request contains an endpoint or a path as the property, and it contains a method, which we saw in the debugger, like get versus post. So in our example, we could see it was a get, and our path was just the slash. It was at the root. And we can invoke multiple functions if we want, and we'll take advantage of that as we go. The idea of middleware, which we'll get to in a little bit later, is the idea that run extra code while we're handling the client request. This is useful for keeping track of what we call a user session. Think about when you go to a website, often it remembers stuff about you. It does that through cookies. We also might want to do some general logging. We might want to do authentication, authorization. We could write all of that code for every endpoint, but that would be like error prone, lead to security issues. It's really tedious. So instead, we're going to write that code once through the use of middleware, and it saves us a huge amount of time. Okay, so let's make our web application here a little bit better. We are going to, so we could write the entire web application right here in server.js. As our application gets more sophisticated, this file could get really long. Just like we wouldn't put all of our Java code in a single Java class, we're going to start to break things up a little bit. So we're going to let server.js just focus on creating the server, and we're going to create a separate JavaScript file for managing all of our routes. Okay. So we're going to create a new file. We're also going to use kind of a standard folder structure, and you'll see this in some of your projects next semester as well. But inside of the server folder, there's several other folders here. We're going to get to most of these later. Today, we're going to look at routes. We're not going to worry about authentication yet, but we are going to create a new file inside of the routes folder. So highlight the routes folder in your file explorer, click on the new file button, and type router.js. And this is where we're going to put all of the code to handle all of the routes that our web application is going to support. And that's going to keep server.js from getting too much code in one place. So in order to do this, we need a reference to Express in order to make all of this work. So we're going to start by getting that reference to Express. So const express equals require express, just like we've done before. And then we want to get a reference to the specific router object for our Express application. Okay, this is what we're going to use to do all of our routes. And Copilot knew that's where we were headed, so we'll just hit tab there. And now router is a reference to that. We're going to move the routing code from server.js into router.js. We're not going to retype it. So I'm going to go to server.js and I'm going to cut all of this code out. And I'm going to go to router.js and paste it all in. We have to make a couple changes because now we're putting the routing code in a different file and we're explicitly using the Express router object. The get method, we don't invoke the get method on the app because we don't have a reference to the app here. That's only in server.js. Instead, we invoke the get method on the route object. Let's actually call this route. I like that better. So route equals express.router, route.get. Same code as before. I'm going to put this, we can leave it good morning, doesn't matter. Maybe I'll put it back as hello world. I like hello world. There we go. All right. As we start writing JavaScript code in different JavaScript files, and we expect to use those files from other JavaScript files, we need to actually export the functions or objects or things that we want to import from other files. So we need to do that right here at the end of this file. And the way we do that is we say module, which is already defined for this particular JavaScript file, dot exports equals route. And what this does is it allows us now to import router.js from a different JavaScript file and get a reference to this route object, which we're going to need to connect to our Express application. Okay. So we just copy and pasted the code here. We did some requirement stuff up at the top. We did an export here at the end. Now, if we switch back to server.js, what we're going to do here is we are going to use that route that we made in the other file. So I'm going to say, I'm going to apply some context here. Why are we doing this? To keep this file manageable, we will move the routes to a separate file. And the exported router object is an example of middleware. This is actually using the Express concept of middleware. We're going to say app.use, okay? App.use is how we connect middleware. Okay. So we're going to say app.use, and for any client requests that start with a slash, which is all of them, because it's the root of our web server, we are going to require that router object, which we import from, this is the relative path. In the current folder, we look inside of the server folder, we look inside of the routes folder, and then we import router.js, which exports that reference to the router object. So this is an example of middleware. App.use is how we inject middleware into the client request. So anytime we get a client request, in this case to anywhere, it's going to shuffle it off to router.js instead. This is a good example of refactoring because we didn't add any new functionality here. We just reorganized our code with an eye towards the future in terms of keeping it manageable and clean, but we didn't change anything. It still runs and works the same way from a functional perspective. Okay. But that's how we get our router.js file started.